In today's video, we're going to continue our NHL Draft history series that we just kicked off here. And today, we're taking a look at the New York Rangers from the last decade. We'll get into that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned today, we're continuing on our new series reviewing the NHL draft history of all 31 NHL teams over the past 10 years. And we're breaking this down into 3 segments. Segment 1, we're taking a look at their history in the first round and whether or not they've had good success turning their first round picks into solid NHL players. We're then going to take a look at their mid to late round picks and see where they've been able to find players later in the draft, and then quickly analyze their current roster and what percentage of their team they've actually drafted and developed themselves. Clearly, this is a draft and develop type of league where you have to be able to draft and develop your own strong, young, solid players to develop a real solid winning atmosphere. Free agency and trades are much more difficult in the salary cap era, so we want to see which teams are actually best at this by taking a deep dive analysis on all their teams. Of course, we kicked things off yesterday with the Montreal Canadiens. If you missed that video, I'll link it up here in the YouTube cards. Otherwise, this is the second installment of the series. So let's jump in now and take a look at the last 10 first-round selections of the New York Rangers. First up, we have 2009 first-round selection where they picked 19 overall, where they selected Chris Kreider. Of course, Kreider's a pretty solid NHL player, had a pretty solid career. He's played in 523 games, put up 319 points. Recently signed a long-term extension, likely going to be an entire career in New York Ranger by the looks of things here. He's certainly been a really solid player for them, turned into a power forward, and I think it's fair to say that that 2009 first-round selection was certainly an excellent choice. Now, unfortunately, we can't say the same for 2010. Now, in 2010, they were picking number 10 overall, and they selected defenseman Dylan McIlrath. McIlrath is definitely the definition of what we'd call a draft bust. Being selected that high, you would certainly expect a pretty decent NHL career, a regular player contributing in some fashion, but McIlrath was never able to put that all together. He only amounted to 66 NHL games. Now let's take a look at some of the other players in 2010 that they passed on in order to take this defenseman, who unfortunately turned into a draft bust. First up, they could have selected defenseman Cam Fowler, so they would have a better choice on the blue line. He went number 12 to the Anaheim Ducks. Even beyond that, they could have taken a couple of really solid forwards and guys who can put up tons of points, including Vladimir Tarasenko of the St. Louis Blues, who ended up going to them at number 16, and Evgeny Kuznetsov, who went to the Washington Capitals at number 26 overall. Clearly, this was not a good choice, and I realize it's not a perfect science. These guys and the scouts and the GMs, they don't have a crystal ball exactly, but clearly there was some much bigger talent in this draft that they could have had. Can you imagine the Rangers over the last decade if they would have been able to have one of those top forwards within their lineup? Would have made an absolutely major difference. Now, jumping ahead to 2011, they selected JT Miller with the number 15 selection. He's had a pretty solid career, been traded a couple times, no longer with the Rangers, but still has had a pretty solid 500-game career to this point, having a solid year with the Canucks. Of course, he was involved in that big Ryan McDonough trade to the Lightning, so he's been gone from the Rangers for some time. In 2012, they selected number 28 overall, where they took defenseman Brady Shea. Of course, Shea had a pretty decent career, signed a long-term deal, and was just traded this past NHL trade deadline for a first-round pick to the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, from 2013, 14, 15, and 16, they did not have a first-round pick. All 4 of those years, those picks were traded. Now, for the most part, they're pretty lucky that none of these other teams were able to turn these first rounders into some big time players. These other teams who ended up with the picks, for the most part, didn't exactly use them the most wise either. In 2013, that pick ended up going to be used by Columbus, where they selected Kirby Reichel. He's never amounted to much in the NHL. 2014, that pick ended up trading hands a few times, going to the Islanders, where they took Josh Hosang. Of course, he's yet to develop into anything. In 2015, that pick did develop into a decent player. After trading hands a couple times, it ended up becoming Anthony Beauvillier of the New York Islanders. And in 2016, that pick also changed hands a couple times. It ended up being Detroit selecting Dennis Cholowski. So clearly they had a long stretch where they were contending, making the playoffs. They were adding a lot at every NHL deadline. And all these picks were used as trade bait in order to keep facilitating these deep playoff runs where they did come close to getting the Stanley Cup, but were never able to complete the task. Now in 2017, they had the number 7th overall pick where they selected Elias Anderson. They also had a number 21 overall pick where they selected Filip Chytil. Now Elias Anderson so far has not amounted to much yet and has demanded a trade from the organization, so that pick is not working out for them so far. Whereas Filip Chytil is having, a pretty decent season right now, and it looks like he could be a big part of their future. Now in 2018, they also had 3 first-round picks. Of course, as you can see here in the later years, they started going through a different type of transition with the team where they were selling off a lot of assets and picking up first rounders to make up for the ones they didn't have before and taking this team through a bit of a rebuild. 2018, they selected Vitali Kravtsov, number 9 overall. Some people thought that was a bit of a reach, and I guess we'll see. He does have tons of talent. He's an exciting player, but he certainly had a rough season. K'Andre Miller was taken number 22 overall, a big defenseman, and then Nils Lundqvist at number 28 for 3 picks in that draft. And of course, that takes us to 2019, where they had some very fortunate luck in the draft lottery and selected number 2 overall, and they took Finnish winger kakko, who certainly appears to have a bright future. Had a bit of a tough rookie season, but overall Kakko's got a ton of talent and should be a player they can continue to build around and make a centerpiece of this franchise here moving forward. So clearly, if you take a look at the summary here of the first round picks, obviously they said there was 4 years there was no pick. The first half of the decade they were all selecting North American born players, for the most part American born players, and then in the second half of the decade they've gone a whole different route here and we're selecting more European born players with Anderson, Chytil, Kravtsov, kakko, etc. So they've had a very different change of philosophy. Of course, to a degree it's the best player available, but when you see trends like this, it obviously kind of makes you wonder that they might have had some different stats and different things they were looking at when making their selections. Now let's take a look here at what other players they were able to grab with their mid to late round picks during that also 9 to 10 year span here. Now in 2009, there was nobody really worth mentioning that's amounted to anything in the NHL. In 2010, they did find themselves a bit of a sleeper with Jesper Fast in the 6th round, number 157 overall. He's turned into a pretty nice player for the Rangers, so that was certainly a nice pickup. In 2011 and 12, there really wasn't anything as well. 2013, they had a couple 3rd round picks develop into some decent players, including Pavel Buchnevich and Anthony Duclair. Of course, Duclair's been traded a few times. Duclair was originally traded from the Rangers over down to the Coyotes, where he was there for a while. Of course, has bounced around a few times since then. And of course, in 2014, they got their goalie of the future, Igor Shesterkin, where they were able to grab him in the 4th round. They had to wait very patiently for him to come to North America, but now that he's here, he's the heir apparent to Henrik Lundqvist and appears to be the not only the goalie of the future, he seems to be the goalie of the present as well. But ever since 2014, they have yet to have any additional mid to late round picks really turn into NHL players. Of course, they had a lot more picks in 2018, 19, even 2017 as well. And some of those picks, obviously, were still too close to that draft time to really say what those players are going to end up amounting to. Obviously, when you're 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th round pick, usually it does take you longer to make it to the NHL if you're fortunate enough to get everything together to get that opportunity. Now let's take a look here at their current roster and see how much of these players that are currently active with the Rangers were actually drafted and developed by the organization. Now if you start in goal, 2 of their 3 current goaltenders were drafted and developed by the Rangers, including Henrik Lundqvist, who was drafted quite a long time ago as a really late round draft steal. That was a really great pickup. And of course, as I mentioned, Igor Shesterkin, 2014, was a 4th round pick out of Russia. And of course, the other goalie, Alexander Georgiev, was an undrafted signing, so that's currently not somebody they've drafted. On defense, the only current active defender who they have on their roster right now who they've drafted and developed was Mark Stahl, who was a 1st round pick way back in 2005. I mean, other than that, every other defender they've been able to acquire either via trade or free agency. Now, if you look at their forward group, they do have some forwards that they've drafted, several of them being 1st round picks as well, including Chris Kreider, who we mentioned in 2009, Filip Chytil in 2017, kakko from 2019 as well. So they have 3 1st round picks in their forward group, and obviously that's a pretty decent statistic. And they also have Pavel Buchnevich and Jesper Fast, we discussed as being mid-round picks between 2010 and 2013, who have turned into pretty decent players for them. So that gives them 8 out of 22 of their active roster being players who were drafted and developed. So that gets them 36%, which obviously in the second installment of the series, obviously we looked at Montreal yesterday, they were much lower, so the Rangers appear to have done a better job at drafting and developing their current players. So certainly will be interesting to look back at their more recent picks here in a few years' time. They've got a ton of potential. They've got a really deep prospect pool as well that they've accumulated between the 17, 18, and 19 drafts. Of course, like I said, a lot of these players are just too early to tell what they're going to be. We can't count them as active members of their roster because they're not just that as of yet, but they built up a pretty decent prospect pool and been able to complete this rebuild in a fairly timely manner and are really competitive again, battling for a playoff spot here not too long after they really began all that. But if you look back early on, like I said, even though they've had a change in general manager with Glenn Sather stepping down and Jeff Gorton taking over about 4 years ago, a lot of the same personnel has been involved when it comes to their scouting department. Even Jeff Gorton was heavily involved in that side of the business before becoming general manager. But it is safe to say that we've seen a little bit of a shift in philosophy, I think, in how they've been doing their drafting. A lot more of their picks early on in this decade that we're reviewing seem to be hitting on as players that have made it to the NHL when they were drafted, more North American born players. So we'll see if the shift here and taking more European born players in the last few years really works out. There's certainly some of them who look to be tremendous, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see if they live up to their potential. So of course, as always, we'll know your thoughts and opinions. What do you think of the New York Rangers drafting history? If you look back, overall they didn't have too many misses, but 2010 certainly was a very interesting year where they took Dylan McIlrath and they could have had Tarasenko or Kuznetsov. This team could have been very different, and just maybe all those years they were so close to winning the Stanley Cup, that might have been an extra piece to put them over the top and bring the Stanley Cup back to Madison Square Garden. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments and we'll continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.